Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the New Directions in Palestinian Studies and DPS mini workshop titled Employing the Body in Resistance, Hunger Strikes by Palestinian Political Prisoners. My name is Bishar Dumani. I'm the Mahmoud Darwish Professor of Palestinian Studies here at Brown University, and I'm moderating this event in my capacity as founder of NDPS, the New Directions in Palestinian Studies, which is an academic initiative within the Center for Middle Eastern Studies here at Brown University. It was established in 2012, and NDPS centers Palestinians in knowledge production projects. Its primary aim is to support emerging scholars and to cultivate research agendas that seek to decolonize and globalize this field of studies in ways that exceed the colonial frame. NDPS includes a number of activities such as workshops, the Mahmoud Darwish Chair, a book series at the University of California Press, special issues of journals, but not least, an endowed postdoctoral position in Palestinian studies. And I'm really very pleased to introduce to you Professor Ashjan Ajour. She is the incoming 2021 Brown University Research Associate in Palestinian and Palestine Studies. Ashjan Ajour is a sociologist whose research focuses on gender studies, political subjectivity, and incarceration. For this event, she will be presenting some of her work in progress and introducing us to the broader research project which she'll be focusing on while at Brown. After about a 20 to 25-minute presentation, two discussants will join us. First of all, Professor Nadia Al-Ali. She's the Robert Family Professor of International Studies, Professor of Anthropology and Middle East Studies, and Director of Middle East Studies here at Brown University. Nadia's main research interests revolve around feminist activism and gendered mobilization, mainly with reference to Iraq, Egypt, Lebanon, Turkey, and the Kurdish political movement. Professor Al-Ali is on the advisory board of Kuhl, a journal of body and gender research, and has been involved in several feminist organizations and campaigns transnationally. Following Professor Al-Ali, we'll be joined by Professor Orisanmi, or you can call him Ori Burton, assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at American University in Washington, D.C. As a social anthropologist working in the United States, Ori's research examines the implication of grassroots resistance and state repression. Professor Burton's research within this broad area of inquiry explores the collision of Black-led movements for social, political, and economic transformation with states' infrastructures of militarized policing, surveillance, and imprisonment. And I want to thank you all for joining us, and we'll get started right away. Let me just also introduce, in the back end, we have Paul Colbury, who is the current postdoctoral fellow in Palestinian Studies here at Brown, and he'll be collecting your questions, which you can put up on the Q&A function here on Zoom. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this workshop. Ashjan, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Bishara, for that. Really, thank you for making a space for this conversation. I'd like to thank the Center for Middle East, especially Barbara, Paul, and Alex. Really, thank you for putting effort to organize this event. I'm really honored to be with conversation with the Professor Nadia Al-Ali and Ori Burton, who will be commenting on my work on progress today. It will help me to develop my work and further in that. So today I'll present my research on lived experience and subjectivity of Palestinian hunger strikers, which is based on my doctorate. I'll be published this research in by Polygraph in a book. So it's currently under contract. And this book entitled Reclaiming Humanity, Revolutionary Subjectivity and Decolonizing the Body. So before I start my presentation and share screen, I just want to say at the moment of presenting today, there are 3 hunger strikers, 3 political prisoners who engage in hunger strike now protesting administrative detention. And I follow up with prisoner club. So the prisoner will engage in collective hunger strike soon. So they are planning for hunger strike. So it's this phenomena, it's still happening. It has a long history. And the first hunger strike was in 1968, but it's contemporary phenomena and it's happening until now. And it's unfinished project, this resistance, this Palestinian resistance, and we're gonna to discuss the historical context of this phenomena. So I'll be sharing a screen now. I'm going to present the research and main argument. So in this presentation, I will discuss how and why Palestinian hunger strikers employed their bodies in anti-colonial prisoner against the settler colonial regime. And, sorry. And this is the structure for my presentation today. I'll introduce the research and give background in terms of methodology, research question. I'll discuss the hunger strike experience in the historical context of settler colonial project. I'll discuss the literature in dialogue with Palestinian case and presenting the key argument and contribution and the way in which I'm going to expand my research and some work on the progress. So this research originates from the painful and inspiring stories of Palestinian hunger strikers. Between 2015 and 2018, I conducted 85 interviews with 5 groups of people, the former hunger strikers who released from prisons, their lawyers, their families and loved ones, activists and leaders of a prisoners' movement. So the research question that is related to this presentations, I'm trying to make it focus on one question. There are many questions in the research. So I'll explore the question of whether hunger strike are violent or non-violent resistance and how the hunger strikers themselves conceptualize the violence of hunger strike. So the violence exercised on Palestinian bodies in Israeli jails must be seen in the broader violence of settler colonialism. So their hunger strike resistance must be seen within the context of settler colonial project and its subjection of Palestinians to different forms of violence since 1948. That's why when I say settler colonial project, it's a structural violence happening since Nakba until now. And political incarceration is an integral part of the broader system of Israeli colonial repression. The prisons were established to suppress political activism in the national struggle for anti-colonial reparation. Since 1968, more than 800,000 Palestinians have been arrested, around 20% of Palestinian population. So prison is a site of violence. It's a key institution of disposition. The research participants I interviewed, they engaged in hunger strike to protest what is called administrative detention. It's a policy by Israeli authorities whereby Palestinian detainees are held without court or a trial, and it happens for unidentified reasons. So administrative detention is experienced by them as a specific form of disposition. In their words, it's a crime against humanity. The literature around the subject. So hunger strike lies in a contested space between violence and non-violence. We might consider hunger strike as an act of non-violence because it's a self-directed violence and doesn't harm the other. However, some authors frame hunger strike as violent action, for example, in contrast with martyrdom operator or suicide bombing. So Alan Feldman, for example, in his book, Formation of the Violence, he thinks that hunger strike fall within the larger context of political violence. And Bargo, in the case of Turkey, she conceptualized the hunger strike as this fast and self-destructive technique in her books, Starve and Immolate. And actually, my research in dialogue with this literature, the research suggests that it's not sufficient framework to understand the phenomenon as a political violence and as a self-destructive. So this reveals only a partial picture of the hunger strike as instance of political action. It's very interesting literature, but it's not sufficient to understand this lived experience. So the way the hunger strike themselves, because I listened to their own understanding, to their narrative, so the way they conceptualize hunger strike, it's resistant to reclaim humanity. It's reclaiming a confiscated humanity that is not reducible to self-destructive violence. Rather, in Franz Fanon's sense, it's a kind of humanizing violence. So my research advances Fanon arguments to explain hunger strike counter-violence as a rehumanizing force, as an act of reclaiming their dispossessed humanity. And the argument here, colonial power is not total and absolute. They rejected the colonial construction of being victims, slaves, zero, living dead in Israeli prisons. The patterns I found in the experience go beyond the binary of violence and non-violence. They are not reducible to this kind of instrumental and strategic kind of language. I will run through the discourse of hunger strike and present how they conceptualize the violence. As you see here, the patterns emerge from the lived experience: dignity, freedom, reclaiming humanity, self-determination, immaterial strength, spiritual purity, and transcendence. These are the voices of the research participants. The main motive of our hunger strike resistance is to reject dehumanization. My dignity is more precious than food. Life without dignity is animal life. I want to live a dignified life. This equation, it's by Hafiz Omar, and it's shared in solidarity with Palestinian hunger striker. Salt and water equal dignity. This is their discourse around reclaiming humanity. My hunger strike decision was a protection of my humanity. Our struggle at the heart is a clear expression of humanity. One of them said that the occupation is inhumane. It's a sort of assault and racism. And it's normal when we live under these conditions, we quest for our life and humanity. We quest for our subjectivity. When I live under inhuman conditions, I decided to reject dehumanization. By violence, they aim to dispossess us of our humanity. But on the contrary, this violence creates it. Such a humanity might take us to this. However, the risk of this maintains our humanity. The self-determination also, it's a pattern emerged from lived experience. It's a control over the body and self-determination to regain agency over the body. One of the former hunger strikers said, in the negotiation, I felt I'm stronger than the Israeli forces because I have a decision. They can do anything with the material body, except the decision of the breaking hunger strike. We are armed with well-just cause and illogical demands. Another political prisoner said, my decision of life or death is in my hand. Immaterialist strengths. So they see that the Israeli state is equipped with material resources, but they possess immaterial internal strength and internal force that support their sumud, steadfastness. For example, these are their voices. Inner strengths won't allow my will to be broken. The spirit and the will are more important than the physical body. So this immaterial strength that emerged, it's a latent energy in their words. This is the language, the original language that emerged, الطاقة الكامنة in Arabic. So it's a hidden power, it's a superpower. It's not a synonym of will or consciousness, but rather all the immaterial faculties of the self, will, spirit, consciousness, related to what the hunger strike term, latent energy or hidden power. Spiritual purity and transcendence. So they live transcendental state near death and a sort of spiritual purity. The physical body was wasting away, but the soul lived in a state of transcendence, spiritual purity, as the weakness of the body allows the hunger strike to exist in this state, transcendent of the soul, of the ruh. So the soul is a concept that they constructed and use in their discourses and their political grammar of resistance. They cultivate spiritual strengths through the collapse of the body. This is from quotation from their account. The soul was fighting, but the body was fatigued. If the body died, it will be the bridge of return. There is no battles without wants. The risk is big and the victory is big. It's the victory of the soul. Love and hope, love was an act of resistance for them, and it was powerful in their resistance. It was the engine of their resistance. For example, Maher al-Akhras, he said, I engage in hunger strike because I want to go back to my children. Khader Adnan, for example, this is quotation, I sent a message to my children to tell them, if I died, I was on my way to you. So they engaged in hunger strike to go back and be with their loved ones. Love is a powerful weapon. Quote, our revenge lies in the laughter of our children. My son opens the letter he sent me with this message by Bobby Sands. And this is this image used for the poster today. It's the artist, she captured Maher al-Akhras' message when he said, I want to go back to my children. And she inspired by a message by his youngest daughter, Tuka, when she said, I want my dad to be back to pick me from school. So as you see the bag in the image, and this is the image of Maher al-Akhras after he stopped his hunger strike, hugging his daughter, Tuka. These more like photos for both of them. Maher al-Akhras is fed by Tuka, and he's waving the victory sign. So the main argument related to the question of this presentation, the question of hunger strike, violence of non-violence, I think, and I argue that this binary, this dichotomy ignores important and rich dimensions of the experience and leaves out the complexity of lived experience. It doesn't make justice to their this existential experience, and it undermines the human agency that emerged out of human suffering. I found patterns of resistance and original language that transcend and transform the political violence in their humanist subjectivation. So this complex political subjectivation shows the singularity of the Palestinian case. The experience for them, it's at the limit of conceptualization. There was no language and no words to describe what they went through, the human suffering and the pain and the spiritual pain when they were living in the edge of life and death. So in a forthcoming article, it will be out soon in July. It will be published in Cultural Politics. This article entitled The Spiritualization of Politics and the Technologies of Resistant Body, Conceptualizing Hunger Strike Subjectivity. So I argue, the argument in this article is that hunger strike, it's not only about weaponization of the body as a political strategy, but also about spiritualization of politics and the limit experience. And it's about cultivating spiritual and strength through the collapse of the body. This is like the way in which I'm going to develop my research. I will expand the gender focus, the gender component of my research, drawing on feminist decolonial lens. So due to the limitation of my PhD, I hadn't the chance to work and develop this. I had very rich and complex material to produce, around 11 chapters. So I'm going to address the gender methods of oppressive techniques and torture that the Israeli prison authority used against Palestinian detainees, in particular techniques of gender violence. So new questions emerges. How does the Israeli prison authority instrumentalize gender and sexuality in their techniques of control? And what are women's techniques of resistance by practicing sumud? I started to develop this in article. I have some work on the progress I shared with the two commentators today. So I worked on co-authored article entitled Women's Political Subjectivity in the Embodied Resistance in Northern Ireland and Occupied Palestine. And in this article, drawing on the accounts of the experience of women, political prisoners in post-occupied Palestine and Northern Ireland, this article explores how female bodies were transformed into site of resistance, and it explicates the way in which women constitute their political subjectivity in a coercive prison system through the practice of resistance. And in the second article, this article has been accepted recently last week by the Journal of Resistance Studies. So when I shared it with Ori, I worked more on it and I developed some aspect of this article. So in this article, it's, as you can see, techniques of resistance through weaponization of the body in Palestinian hunger strike. It gives detailed account of techniques and technologies of resistance associated with hunger strike against Israeli colonial settler regime. So this article gives new insights on 3 phases of hunger strike in a prison, starting from the first phase, the peak of hunger strike and physical starvation, the advanced phase of negotiation, and how the prisoners sustain their struggle by their mood in the face of colonial machine, and how they weaponize their bodies by refusing to eat until they have forced Israeli authorities to negotiate their release and they grant their freedom. Thank you. This is a sculpture of a victory made in solidarity with Palestinian hunger striker in 2017, and it's made by Lebanese supporter. As you can see, the fork is transformed into a symbol of victory. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashjan.
How many minutes, Bishara?
You did fine.
I lost the sense of time. How many minutes?
You did fine, and I think we're ready to move on with Nadia.
Sure, yes. Yeah, thank you very much. So, Ashjan, as you know, I'm going to restrict my comments more specifically to the paper you shared with me, which is a co-authored, hopefully forthcoming paper entitled Women's Political Subjectivity and the Resistant Body in Prison Protests. And it's looking at Northern Ireland and colonized Palestine. So I really enjoyed the paper. And so the article looks at accounts and experiences of 2 distinct empirical contexts and time periods. So that's Northern Ireland in the 1980s and Palestine between 2015 and 2018 to illustrate a few points. First, that, as you already mentioned, that incarceration is gendered and women prisoners are being disciplined, controlled, and punished in gendered ways. And secondly, and I would say more importantly, in terms of the argument of the paper, rather than experiencing incarceration passively, women in both contexts are resisting, using their sexual bodies to challenge, to disrupt the prison system that in turn, of course, is based on the wider system of oppression, of colonialism. There also, and that is a crucial element, resisting sexism and patriarchy. Both contexts leave us in no doubt that the gendered body is not only acted upon, an instrument to insert power on, but it is also a political actor that needs to be taken seriously when we theorize power, resistance, subjectivity, and collective mobilization. Both resistance strategies, and I should say, I mean, because people, might not be familiar. So in the Northern Irish context in the 1980s, there was a strategy of no washing, and the strategy of not washing for women. I mean, they were using excrements and menstrual blood to evoke a sense of taking control, but also distance themselves from the prison guards. And then in the Palestinian context, of course, hunger strike is also, a very, I mean, it's can be a gendered form of resistance. While meant to unsettle and disrupt the prison system and its underlying system of power and oppression, the very forms of resistance are primarily affecting women's own bodies. The turning inwards as a way to resist the oppressive outward, especially in the context of hunger strike, involves a weakening of the body, depriving it of sustenance, causing physical discomfort, illness, suffering, and possible death. Now, the effects of these protests are unpredictable and ambiguous. Hunger connotes frailty and potentially victimhood, but crucially, hunger can also signify power, strong will, and a passionate dedication to a cause. The bodily resistance of female prisoners becomes even more powerful because it disrupts gendered ways of intimidation and control, as well as gendered tropes of vulnerabilities. It is not a coincidence that in the Irish context, it is the woman's no-wash strategy that got most attention, and within this, anything linked to menstrual blood, which historically and cross-culturally is frequently perceived to be dirty, to be polluting. In the Palestinian context, female prisoners not only challenged the Israeli prison system through their personal embodied forms of resilience and resistance through hunger strike, but female prisoners also resist and almost turn on its head Israeli techniques to induce fear and torture based on the presumption that women would protect their honor. We have known this for a while, mainly based on Nahla Abdou's excellent work, how stereotypical and often Orientalist conceptions of Palestinian society's ideas of morality and honor very much guide the interrogation and torture techniques of Israeli prison guards. And we also know that Palestinian women have managed to challenge these through their reactions that were often unexpected and transgressive. Both the bodies of the women who refused to wash themselves and use their body fluids to actually create a space for themselves, however uncomfortable, or the women who engage in hunger strikes in Israeli prisons are asserting their individual ability to resist. Importantly, the protesting individuals are embodied and they use their bodies creatively and in a transformative manner. In a situation that looks like total powerlessness on both account of their political prisoner status, in this profoundly unjust and brutal political context, but also as women in a deeply patriarchal and sexist context, the female prisoners exert power by taking control of their bodies. At the same time, through their actions, they also transcend the individual punishment and the individual body while becoming part of a collective body of resistance. The individual bodies of the Palestinian women engaged in a hunger strike emerge as part of a political collective and identification that requires sacrifice. And here I feel what is missing in the current narrative of the paper Ashjan is the recognition that the embodied resistance of female prisoners in both the Irish and the Palestinian context is linked to wider political movements, particular political dynamics, and I would argue also very crucially, specific political moments. The Palestinian women prisoners are not randomly choosing to engage in hunger strike, but their decision to engage in this form of resistance is informed by their political socialization and prevalent political narratives. Personally, I do not want to engage in a debate whether hunger strike are forms of violent or non-violent resistance. I think that's a false dichotomy. But while it is clear that hunger strikes have played important roles in different political struggles in South Africa, I'm thinking first the suffragettes in Britain used hunger strike, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, the Irish Republican movement, the Kurdish political movement, and of course the Palestinian political movement. But I would caution us to talk about hunger strike in romanticized ways. It seems to me that there are certain political moments when political movements have used their followers' willingness to sacrifice themselves in instrumental or even irresponsible ways, leading to the death of political prisoners without either much media attention nor political gains. And I'm not saying that this is the case in the context of the the female Palestinian prisoners you depict, Ashjan, but I think it is important to actually look at the specific political context. So, basically what I'm trying, political context matters. And although I agree that there is potential to look jointly and comparatively at both the Northern Irish prison no wash protests in the 80s and more recent hunger strikes amongst Palestinian prisoners, I would say that this needs to be explored and analyzed much more carefully. There are, after all, very different historical moments, different political contexts and movements, and also different forms of resistance. Now, for me, the paper raises larger conceptual questions about the relationship between nationalism and feminism. So we know, of course, when you look at the literature, and I don't want to go into much depth here, but there was sort of this early wave of mainly Western-based, white, middle-class feminists who basically said nationalism is detrimental to feminism. And then since the work of Kumari Jayawardena 25 years ago, who looked at nationalist movement in the context of liberation movements that gave actually space, provided space for feminism, we've looked at that relationship in much more sort of careful ways. I mean, myself and Nicola Pratt have worked on that relationship in the Kurdish movement, in the context of the Kurdish movement. And I think it's really important to look at the question, what kind of nationalism, so what kind of political movement at what specific political time, and also what kind of feminism are we looking at? So if you look at both of the examples provided in the paper, women are clearly invested in being part of these national independence and liberation movements. In the Irish Republican context, they clearly joined to erase or at least minimize gender differences within the Sinn Féin movement. Meanwhile, both the Irish and the Israeli state has been targeting female bodies in a sexual manner precisely because of their role in being both the biological and symbolic reproducers of the nation. And I understand that I'm not an expert, but I do understand that despite the Irish women's action during the 1980 Armagh prison protests, trying to challenge sexist attitudes within their own movement, women's issues did not become a priority for Sinn Féin. And some women activists have alleged that they have been excluded from decision-making processes. In the Palestinian context, women and gender-based claims have always taken a backseat. And there have been, historically, there's always been sort of this idea, well, we first need to, liberate the nation and deal with the occupation. But I understand that recently, since 2019, there has been this new wave of, sort of feminist organizing, I think the Talat movement and others, that is actually saying, well, we can't just always prioritize, national liberation. I mean, it's not, obviously, it's impossible to not speak about the Israeli occupation, when you're in Palestine, but that, women's issues need to also, given a greater space and priority. So I guess, what I'm asking you is to kind of reflect more carefully on the broader political context, and if you take, two examples that are so distinctly different, both in terms of historical time period, empirical context, and also form of embodied resistance, then I'd like to see a sort of more in-depth sort of analysis of, what is similar, why is it possible to compare, and what are the differences as well. And I guess sort of effect as well, so what is the impact of these strategies? And that is then again linked to the specific political moment. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ali. Professor Burton.
Hello, happy to be here. Thank you for this opportunity. I was asked to respond to a work in progress entitled Techniques of Resistance Through Weaponization of the Body in Palestinian Hunger Strike, which was a work in progress that I greatly enjoyed reading and learned a lot from. Has a lot of resonance with my own work, and happy to respond to it here. The piece brings us into Israeli prisons and onto the front lines of movements which took place between 2012 and 2018, but which Ashjan reminds us are still ongoing at this moment. Ajour examines techniques of resistance deployed by Palestinian political prisoners in relation to techniques of colonial power deployed by Israeli prison authorities. She argues that through hunger striking, Palestinian political prisoners deploy techniques and technologies of resistance that, quote, operate through the duality they create between the physical body and the immaterial soul acquired by instrumentalizing their bodies and transforming them into weapons, end quote. She makes a distinction between techniques of resistance and technologies of resistance, where the latter constitutes an articulation of an already existing mode of contestation, and the former is a technology which constitutes the innovation of a new means of struggle against oppression. Drawing on 85 in-depth interviews with former political prisoners, she takes us through 3 stages of hunger strikes. The initial phase in which prison authorities subject hunger strikers to brutal forms of humiliation and torture in an effort to determine their level of seriousness and whether or not they're actually willing to die. The second stage, she calls the peak of the hunger strike, which begins after about a month of struggle and which involves strikers being transferred to hospitals where they're chained to beds, force-fed, offered vitamin supplements to extend their life or to prevent their death. And negotiations occur during the final stage, which she calls the advanced stage. And here, a mediator intervenes to attempt to bring the hunger strike to an end without any deaths in the strikers and to prevent either side from feeling like they've lost. So I felt like this was a useful contribution to our understanding of Palestinian resistance in particular and prison struggles in general, in that it sort of outlines a logic and a broader sort of strategic imperatives to the notion of hunger strike and breaking them up into different phases. I appreciated your problematization of the violence, nonviolence dyad at the beginning of your talk, which I think is central and relates to my own work, where I interview a lot of former members of the Black Panther Party who often maintain that there's no such thing as a nonviolent struggle. And in the US context, struggles such as the civil rights movement and the Montgomery bus boycott, while often held up as being the pinnacle of nonviolence, were actually extremely violent, but it was just one-sided violence for the most part, right? But even in that protest, what you see is the strategic use of violence. In the very act of not reciprocating violence, what they're doing is highlighting the violence of the regime that they're contesting in the hopes that it will elicit outrage from the international community, right? So nonviolence is the use of violence, right? So the whole violence and nonviolence binary is not very helpful, I think. So I appreciated that. As a technique of resistance deployed in these different contexts of asymmetrical struggle, and I think that's where hunger strikes are, right, situated in terms of a context of the struggle. They happen when a struggle is at a certain phase of sort of demobilization, that this kind of self-deprivation is one of the only means that's available. They're typically theorized as deriving power from their ability to contest the legitimacy of a targeted regime by, like I said, mobilizing international pressure. But your piece hints at this, but it's actually making a different argument, which is that that's not what's at stake. The body's not what's at stake. What's at stake is the soul and the preservation of the ongoing will to struggle against a settler colonial regime. And you argue that the Israeli prison authority targets the soul in an effort to destroy Palestinian national consciousness, and that political prisoners are weaponizing their bodies in order to resist this process, which I would argue isn't just resistance, it's actually more active and proactive, insofar as it's about the reproduction and regeneration of a kind of national.
I think Walid Daqqa, he mentioned this. And
yeah, he talks about it quite a bit in his essay. So I'm arguing, I think that it's actually more proactive than simply resistance, that we need to think about it as actually the production and the reproduction of certain forms of collective understanding. But your work subverted my expectation of weaponization as a concept. Because when I think of weaponization, I think of transforming a neutral object into an instrument that can be used to attack an opponent, but that's not what you see happening necessarily with the hunger strikes. Instead, you're arguing that Palestinian hunger strikers are transforming their bodies into instruments in order to strengthen Sumud and the soul. But here I want to offer a counter reading, which is that it seems to me that in the first instance, it's the Israeli prison authority that is weaponizing the bodies of Palestinian political prisoners insofar as it's physically punishing and, well, in the first instance, removing them from the land, putting them in prisons, and then punishing the bodies while they're in prisons in an effort to break their will to resist. Within this larger context of trying to clear Palestinians from the land. And if this is true, then what the Palestinian political prisoners are doing is in fact a form of counter weaponization, right? Left with no other means of defending their minds and bodies against this onslaught. They're immersing themselves within a profound form of deprivation and suffering, which takes their jailers' power to punish them away from the jailers, right? And this dynamic is revealed by a statement that you quote from Kader Anan, who says, and you quote him as saying, one of the Israeli military officers came and informed me that I was being punished by depriving me from family visits. I told him, what a contradiction. How can you punish me while I am the one who is punishing myself? So you can't control me. So again, I think this conceptualization of weaponization needs to be understood within the context of them being immersed within this onslaught of attack, where one of the few instruments that they have at their disposal is to at least exert some control over how that suffering is going to take place. So I'd be interested in hearing you talk about this notion of counter-weaponization. Also in your talk, you mentioned the singularity of the Palestinian experience, which I'd be interested in hearing about. I know that on the apartheid wall, at least in 2018, there was a artwork commemorating the prisoner hunger strikes in Pelican Bay, California in 2013. Which was happening in the United States at the same time that the Palestinian hunger strikes were happening. And then in 2016 and 2018, there's also been hunger strikes here. And I know that people in Palestine are aware of what's going on here and vice versa. So I'd be interested in hearing about any of that dialogue and how that may or may not have informed strategy, tactics, understanding of goals. Also, I couldn't help but think about the South African context while reading this piece. And it seemed to me that Steve Biko wrote about, consciousness in a way that resonates with what Walid Daqqa was writing about. So in I Write What I Like, he says, quote, the philosophy of Black consciousness expressing group pride and the determination by the Blacks to rise against the envisaged self. At the heart of this kind of thinking is the realization by the Blacks that the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed, right? So it's this idea that what's happening is a battle for the interiority of what's inside the body, not the body itself. And of course, South African prisoners on Robben Island routinely engaged in large-scale hunger strikes, even though that was a tactic that was not universally supported by the prisoners themselves. So Steve Biko was assassinated in 1977, and the initial story was that he died in prison while on hunger strike. But before his assassination, he told his comrades that in the event of his death, any story that he died while on hunger strike should be understood as a lie, because he told his comrades that he would never endanger his own life while in detention. Similarly, Nelson Mandela, who participated in hunger strikes while he was a political prisoner for 27 years, wrote the following in his autobiography. For me, hunger strikes were altogether too passive. We who were already suffering were threatening our health, even courting death. I have always favored a more active militant style of protest, such as work strikes, go slow strikes, or refusing to clean up, actions that punish the authorities, not ourselves. They wanted gravel, we produced no gravel. They wanted the prison yard clean, it was untidy. This kind of behavior, you're distressed and exasperated them, whereas I think they secretly enjoyed watching us go hungry. So this was his critique. Of course, he participated in hunger strikes because that was the collective understanding and that was the collective agreement of where the movement needed to go. So I'm wondering if in any of the 85 interviews you did any dissent around this tactic emerge? Because you talk about how it's the sort of dominant strategy of resistance, but not the only one. And so I'm wondering if other kinds of critiques or criticisms of this tactic emerged. And then sort of the last thing I'll say is that I appreciated your theorization of where the prison falls into the broader settler colonial project, how it is sort of an essential part of that project. But I would like to hear more of a sense of how you see hunger striking fitting into a broader anti-colonial project. Because, you know, I would like, because you talk about how hunger strikes sort of challenge the sort of neoliberalization of resistance in the post-Oslo context. So I'd like to hear about that. And I'd like to hear about how the sort of knowledge that is generated through hunger striking is diffused throughout the population. Like once these political prisoners get out, how is that information conveyed? How is the sort of preservation of the soul that they generate under these conditions, how is that then circulated outside of the community? Because one thing you say is that some of the political prisoners use their successful engagement in hunger strikers as an opportunity to present themselves as heroes, and that other people within the movement are critical of that. And when I read that, I found it interesting because here in the United States, where we have political prisoners, even though the US government denies the existence of political prisoners, a big part of the struggle here is to help other people understand that political prisoners who engage in struggles are heroes, so that we understand that there is a struggle that needs to be continued. So I thought that that sort of conflict was interesting. But yeah, I would love to hear you talk a little bit about how the struggle of political prisoners on hunger strike is then sort of externalized outside of the prison. How does it contribute to a larger anti-colonial movement in the contemporary moment? And that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ori. What a terrific presentation and responses, including to the works in progress. We have a lot on the table here. I urge people to start writing in their questions. We already have a few under Q&A, but I want to give maybe Ashjan a chance to get into a small conversation with the discussants about some of the issues that they raised while people prepare themselves. And if I can just add two tiny points here. One is, I was struck by your reference to the poverty of conceptual language that's available to try to explain what is going through their minds as they are on hunger strike and what they're feeling. The poverty of conceptual language is an oft repeated issue in a lot of our workshops, because we seem to be at a political impasse in many ways. The old political language is not working as well as people would like it to. And so I'm wondering how you deal with the vocabulary in Arabic and how you translate it, and if you have any insights on trying to bridge this conceptual divide through the language. How does that work for you? And the other tiny point is having a seat on the political table for prisoners is very, very important in the Palestinian case, and I'm sure elsewhere as well. Hunger strike is one manifestation of that, but another is letters, joint letters between the different factions in the prisons of political prisoners who take a position on something that's happening that of great importance, such as the division between Fatah and Hamas, for example, and how these divisions can be bridged. In other words, they're trying to set guidelines and policies for other Palestinians to follow based on their legitimacy as political prisoners who are currently paying the price of defending Palestinian liberation movement. So that goes to Ori's question about the circulation and reception of prisoners' actions. And in the case of the Palestinians, there's an election pending, and one of the major figures in the whole election process is a Palestinian prisoner as well. Just for your consideration as we get ready to get the Q&A going. Ashjan, you want to?
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Go ahead. I said you want to pick a few issues to address?
Yeah. I start with Nadia. Thank you so much, Nadia, for the reflection and the feedback. It's really very helpful. And I admire your work on women on Middle East, and I'm excited to work with you in the future to develop the gender component of my project. So it's really very helpful feedback. You are asking, I'm trying like to take notes. This, in order to develop this relation, the women lived experience and hunger strike in relation with the broader political movement. As you said, because the decision is political and it's related to the politics outside. So what kind of political movement? Of course, I reflected in my research on the historical context of Palestine, but like to reflect more broadly, as you said, with more in-depth analysis. So I agree with you, like when we approach women in hunger strike, we are talking about like indigenous people, indigenous women in the context of settler colonial project. And when I'm talking about settler colonial project, it's like it's violence structure. It's not events. It's a structural violence since Nakba until now. And these people are like freedom fighters who are affiliated with political parties and in the context of struggling colonialism. That's why they are in prisons. I mean, these people were in prisons because they are due to their activism and political movement. So
sorry to interrupt, Ashjan. Yes, sure. But my point is, but what is the role of women within that movement? So it's not, obviously they're part of the wider movement, but we know that any kind of liberation movement, there are also, there are gender issues within that movement, right? And we know explicitly, in the Irish context, I read, I think your co-author Azrini Wahidin has actually published a whole paper on that, and the first part is sort of based on that. And it's clear that, I've read other stuff in the Irish context where women precisely engaged in the no wash strategy because they felt that the movement wasn't taking them seriously, right?
Yeah.
So, so the question is, what is the role of women, and also what is the role of gender-based claims within the Palestinian movement. And that is not linear. I think temporality is so important at specific moments. Like right now, there's a very different discourse than there was in 2015.
Yeah,
I mean, not that there's a totally different discourse, but there are new voices, right?
Yeah, exactly. I agree with you. For example, to respond to the question, I'll like the participants, the narrative and the accounts from the participant, these people, these women imprisoned. Maybe I agree with you. I have to, like, who are these people and why they are imprisoned? Both of them, they are engaged in hunger strike because of administrative detention, because they are sisters of freedom fighters. Like in one of the quote, if you notice, the Israeli soldier in the moment of imprisonment, he told her, if you are a woman of a real man, you can take your baby with you. So they just invaded her house and imprisoned her because she's a sister of freedom fighter, because her brother, her brother, he conducted a military action against Israelis, and he imprisoned for and he's under integration, and they wanted to bring his sister to put the pressure on him in interrogation. So you can see like how the women is used and how the misconception about the Palestinian culture, I mean the sexuality and this assumption about women culture is used in integration. So this is like give you an idea about like how these women were used and why they are in prisons, because they are brought under, and of course administrative detention, women, men, students, activists, all of them, they are like held in detention without court or a trial. So it's not only, sometimes because people are affiliated with political parties, they are in detention. So these women, one of them, she's active in resistance, and she conducted a military action against Israelis. But the other one, she's under detention because of her brother. So how these, I mean, women are used again. Yeah, I agree with you, like nationalism and colonialism and this relation and the use of literature, I have to use in the article. So thank you. It helps, it's very helpful to develop these dimensions. Okay, so due to time limitation, I have to go to Ori. I thank you so much for the comments and the feedback. It's really important, very important points to take into consideration. So I start with the first point when you said, when you reflect on the use of strategic violence, and I like the way you articulated it. Non-violence is the use of violence of the settler regime. Very interesting, exactly. So the idea of hunger strike, it's like, in their words, they said our strength and our weakness in the weakness of the body. So like they employed the body in resistance to threaten the settler regime by their death. So they use like the death against the settler regime. They use the non-violence resistance to challenge and to disrupt the operation of power and to disrupt the violence of the Israeli state, because they know very well that they don't want the Israeli state, they don't want the prisoners to die. So if you need like as you read in the article, both parties in the dynamic of the negotiation, the fear of death forced both parties, the prisoners and Israelis authorities, to negotiate. So, but actually they exposed the bodies of hunger strike to death. When they expose them for and use and manipulate them for 60 days, and sometimes in some cases for 100 days, when they at the edge of death, in the dangerous state, when the body collapses and the function of the heart, and they start the negotiations. So they don't want, my point, they don't want the prisoners to die, and that's why they negotiate. And for hunger striker, as long as they negotiate, we are the stronger party in the equation. So as long as you negotiate with me, I have the decision. So they develop a sort of control, and as I said, self-determination. So the decision of death and life in the hand with those who resist. So yes, they use the weakness of the body to challenge, and the non-violence to challenge the violence of Israeli regime. So this is the first point. The second point around the soul. And as you see in the article, I draw on Walid Daqqa, the way he analyzes and theorizes and conceptualizes the torture in Israeli prisons authorities, and the shift in their practices. Because as he argues, the soul, the target is no longer the body and the torture and the violence, but the target is the soul, and it speaks to the discourse of hunger striker. It goes online with, they know that the target is to dehumanize and to break the spirit and to kill. That's why the technology of resistance, they strengthen the soul. They wanted to protect the soul. But I like your argument around the counter weaponization, and the body is important as well. Because when they engaged in resistance, they aspire freedom, they aspire life, they want to go to their loved ones, they are not suiciders. So for them, they created this binaries between body and soul as a technology of the resistance, but for them, they live this contradiction. So, and they reconcile this contradiction. They know that they are embodied and they use the body as an instrument, but at the same time, they disembodied themselves to counter the weaponization. They care of the body and they live a conflict, and they live this ambivalence in negotiation stage, which is a battle inside the battle. They live internal conflict with themselves. I don't want to die. Why I'm doing this to myself? This is the internal conflict they have. But when the negotiator come and they speak to them, they drive the energy, and this antagonistic relation strengthens them, and they sustain and they continue. There are moments where they wanted to break the hunger strike. So they live this conflict about what will happen to my body. I might be disabled. And actually some of them, they have some physical problems. This is the price they pay. And they know, they said, we pay the price for resistance. So this is their discourse about the soul. I don't want to be dehumanized and to dispossessed. And this is the reason for hunger strike. They believe that they are experience a form of disposition of humanity, dispossessed of social bonds and loved ones in a coercive, captive subject. Is different from the colonial normal subject outside the prison. It's the way, the phenomenology of like the experience of a prison. It's time without time. It's a live dead. Like I reach a point, there is a project of dehumanization. I'm not dehumanized. So they transform, like they're from being, I say, active victim into resistant subject by engaging to protect the soul. And the body was the last resort for them to use it to protect the soul. But at the same time, the body is important for them, and they don't want to die again. So they live this contradiction, and they're like political discourse and political grammar about the body. For example, the body is the bridge of return. If the body died, it will be the bridge of return. And here I go to your important point about the relation with settler colonial project and anti-colonial resistance. It's apparently like the hunger strike is intense representation of antagonistic relation between colonizer and colonized. It's like a battle of existence. In their words, battles of will. So like in this encounter of hunger strike, in this prolonged and human suffering over like 100 days, it tells us the lived experience, which appears that it's singular and individual, but it reveals the lived experience, reveals the macro politics and what's going on. So these individuals, just so big, because you are asking me to give a background about the collective community and how they are perceived as heroes and their relation. I just want to say that when I started my research in between 2015 to 2018, there was a prominent form of resistance, individualized form of resistance, and it coincidence with collective as well. So there were waves of individual hunger strike after Oslo. And these individuals, in light with the deterioration of the national struggle and in the post-Oslo area, these people, these individuals, they represent the anti-colonial resistance at the time of deterioration. And so they, in other words, I would say they take distance from Oslo politics. They
Ashjan,
represent decolonization. Sorry.
That's a great segue into one of many questions that we have. I'm wondering if this is a good time for me to throw some questions from the audience your way. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have about 15 minutes left, and I just wanted to get to some of those questions. You won't be able to answer all of them, obviously, but I just want to give you a sense of what some of the people are asking. You were talking about Oslo just now, and the first question we received is if your project will look at hunger strikes within PA prisons. Have there been hunger strikes in PA prisons and or not? Another question, and I'll just, but this one by Alex, who is was also a postdoctoral fellow in Palestinian studies here at Brown, Alex Winder. He says, thank you for sharing your work and for the excellent comments from Nadia and Ori. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on the idea of love that you raise in your presentation. You focus in your remarks on love of family, but I was wondering if there were other objects of love that feature in the language of hunger strikers: love with their fellow prisoners, love of the nation, love of freedom, love of the self, etc., and whether different objects of love speak to different ways of understanding the hunger strikes themselves. There's a couple other questions. How is this form of Palestinian resistance contributing to the concept of a movement against the Israeli government, which I suppose is a general question that you've addressed in some ways, and I'll give you one more. And this one is by Professor Srivanti Mitter. I was struck by Professor Al-Ali's evocation of the question of effectiveness or not of hunger strikes. My question is whether the hunger strikers themselves are concerned with that or not.
Again, I didn't get the last one. Please, could you
sure.
please repeat
Yes,
it?
this is from Professor Mitter. She was struck by Professor Ali's evocation of the question of effectiveness or not of hunger strikes. That is to say, Professor Mitter's question is whether the hunger strikers themselves are even concerned with this question or not. She also says there were a lot of comments from both discussants on comparing the Palestinian hunger strikers to other historical contexts in Ireland, South Africa, etc. Here, I would just like to invoke Mahatma Gandhi's hunger strikes in India during the anti-colonial struggle in the 1930s. Do the Palestinian hunger strikers evoke these very specific historical examples in their discourse, or is this for them a specifically Palestinian response? I'll stop here, and if we have time, we'll go to more questions.
Thank you so much. I start with the first question, Alex, about Palestinian prisons. It's really important question. By the way, the research participants who I interviewed, some of them, they were imprisoned, sadly, unfortunately, in Palestinian prisons as well. And they engaged in resistance. So they faced the same techniques of torture. Sometimes it happened in Israeli prisons, and they had it as well in Palestinian prisons. So yeah, there are some prisoners who imprisoned, and the hunger striker, they lies between the violence of Palestinian authorities and the violence of Israeli prisons. I will keep it like short answer. I go for the second question to elaborate on the question of love. As I said, it really was the motive and the engine of resistance for the hunger strikers when they lived this existential and painful experience. And this is what motivated them. They wanted to be freed, to be with their loved ones. And what was shocking about like love, the love for the mother, I devoted maybe like 10 pages in one chapter just to write about the role of mothers and the love to the mothers. The Israeli authorities, sometimes they manipulate this emotion and love that the freedom fighters have with their loved ones, and they brought in the dynamic of negotiation, they brought the Palestinian mothers to the hunger strikers to convince them to break their hunger strike. And the striking about that the mothers not only surprised the Israeli jailers, but she surprised their sons. She told them, eat, don't eat. So sustain your hunger strike. So they used this and they manipulated the love towards their loved ones in hunger strike. But it's really like, I don't know, like it's in their words, it's beyond language and it's unspeakable. When I told them, for example, I recall in one of interviews when I asked him to tell me about, like I asked one of the participants, tell me about like these intimate moments, for example, when you broke hunger strike and go back finally to be with your loved ones. And when he started like just to speak about these moments and his feelings after this suffering, he just looked straight at my eyes and he said, Ashjan, there are things that are not said but wept. So it's really beyond language. That's why when I said the spiritual pain and the transcendence they lived, it's not like individual, it's linked with these people outside Like, for example, when one of them was in this hallucination stage at the end of the hunger strike, he said, I lived this spiritual pain and I saw my father, the martyr, or my friend, the martyr. So this love fed this resistance and helped them to sustain. And it was the motive behind their sumud. This question about to what extent it's effective. This is Nadia comment, like the hunger strike effective or not, and how the hunger strike think that it's effective or not. Yes, I think it's very rational and political decision for them when they took it. It was the last resort. Like maybe one of us like think how we can't imagine like to go if we can't eat until like after one day. So how these people, because it was like, as I said, in their discourse, it's like they are dehumanized and they felt that they are edge of like being victim. And it was, I wanted to understand, like I wanted to understand how these people reach this decision to endanger themselves and to endanger their life and to engage in a very painful experience. But بالعربي بشارة بيحكوا ما جبرك على المر إلا الأمر منه. يعني بدي أحكي لك عن جد. فهذا يعني this decision, yeah, we can't imagine, but it's effective or not. Like it's a process to reclaim humanity. Like this is the last resort. I have to do it. I don't have option. And if you ask me about like the macro level, you keep asking me about the relation with the collective movement. Unfortunately, like there are some hunger strikers, they have, for example, Hamas think that it's haram to engage of hunger strike. And they make this individual decision to challenge their parties as well. So this person, when he engaged in this like this painful experience, it was the last result. Some of them 14 years, they didn't see their, due to administrative detention. One of them 14 years, he was in administrative detention. Every 6 months, they renew it. And he said, between these 14 years, I go out to see my children. After 5 years, he grew up and he didn't recognize me. So his son, he said, I hate you. So he said, like, I don't have a life. My relation with loved ones damaged. Everything, my life collapsed. So when I say like prison is disposition of the humanity, it's like they experience disposition of existential needs, social bonds, love, dignity. When they are talking about dignity, they are disposed of hope and the future. Like the idea of administrative detention, they don't know when they will be released. They said, if I know when I will be released. So like it's a control on the future as well. So if I know how many years I'm sentenced, that's fine. But it's control on the future, on the hope, on the like disposition of love, of a future, of. So it's like a rational decision to challenge this dehumanization. So for them, it's like they know that they will pay the price. As I said in one of the quotation, every battle there is want, but we have to do it because in their words, violation is assault of humanity. It's racism. It's so yeah, the way they calculate it, it's different from our, like it's unresolved question. Like the hunger strike is really until now, my research asked unresolved question about this experience. So it's really beyond even this question about effectiveness. So these people who are the battles of, who are the philosophy of the battles, they can answer this question, this strategic question about effectiveness or not effective.
Thank you, Ashjan. We have a couple of people who may want to ask their question in person, but I noticed that we only have 3 minutes left. I'm wondering if they'll forgive me for not allowing that and ask Professor Ali and Professor Burton if they have some concluding remarks. You can unmute if you want to say something. No? Okay. Francis, did you want to ask your question? Adil, all right. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Francis.
sure. Sorry. I know, Shada, you asked me and I couldn't figure out how to respond to your chat. It's strange.
We're all learning Zoom these days.
Yeah, no, it's just, yeah, and especially the webinar is different from the other functions. So I did not read your work, Ashjan, so and I hope you get the comments that Shada and Nadia give you all these comments so that you can look at them afterwards. So it's hard to respond without reading work. So basically I have a couple of points and you don't have to address them now. Just one is that I think if you're thinking about gender and sexualization, you cannot delimit it just to cis women's bodies. One thing I was curious about and I could have missed is that how many of the prisoners were women that you interviewed? Third, there is quite a lot of excellent feminist and queer and kind of decolonial scholarship on starvation and prisoner hunger strikes. And one person you might want to read, especially on spiritual, the spiritual dimensions, is Parama Roy's work on Gandhian, the way in which spiritualization and hunger and starvation can work. So I have a lot of things I could say, but it's hard without reading. But I really enjoyed the presentation and also the commentaries.
Thank you, Francis. You had a terrific point, which I'll also pass on to Ashjan, about the Catholic Church and Irish hunger strikes and the question of menstruation, that there's always an internal conversation that's also going on beyond just the colonizer and the colonized, obviously. And that is terrifically important. And I know the person you're talking about, Ashjan, who was on administrative detention for 10 years. I went to meet him and when he was released, and he's back now in prison. But it is really important to think about the internal family dynamics that they're going through, and in relationship with his wife, with his children, etc., and how political work in many ways becomes a marriage of sorts, a forced marriage of sorts in his case, that complicates everything. Hadil, I see you on the screen. Did you want to ask something? All right, I'm not sure how if she's still with us. Well, if Ori and Nadia don't have anything else to say, I think we can just thank everybody for joining us for a very difficult but important subject. We hope to be continuing this conversation, especially over the next 2 years, as Ashjan Ajour joins us as the postdoctoral fellow in Palestinian studies here at Brown University. It's an endowed position that we're very proud of, and want to thank everybody for making it possible. And we look forward to having you among us very soon. And thank you, everybody, for joining. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.